All right, thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone to this webinar on working with Blackmagic Design Fusion right from within Davinci Resolve. Now, before I get rolling, I just want to mention that I actually live pretty close to an airport, so there might be times where you might hear a plane flying over top of my house. Don't worry, that's not a sound effect I put in there. Sometimes I just get those planes going while I'm doing my tutorials. Now, I'm very excited about this webinar. Why am I excited about it? Well, because Fusion has kind of become my new little pet project. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, to be honest, I haven't had this much fun learning a new application in a long time. You know, it sort of takes me back to the days of Avid DS where you had editing and high-end compositing inside of the same application. And that's essentially what Blackmagic Design has done. They've taken these two powerful applications, Resolve for, I'm going to say, for its up-and-coming editing capabilities, which are pretty darn good right now, plus its obviously super powerful color grading and color correction tools, and it's merged them with this high-end compositing application. Now, with this webinar, the goal is I want to start out by talking a little bit, just very briefly, about the history of Fusion. Then what I want to do is get in, show you a little bit of how we currently do compositing inside of Resolve. Then what we're going to do is we're going to switch into Fusion and pretty much spend most of the rest of our time there. We're going to go through a few different techniques that's going to sort of give you a good overlay of exactly what you're going to need to know to get yourself up and running with this awesome new application. Now, believe it or not, Fusion has actually been around for quite a while. The very first version of it was released as a Windows-only application called Digital Fusion way back in 1996. Now, that was Fusion version 1. Now, if you can believe this, Blackmagic Design actually purchased Fusion back in 2014. Now, Fusion is still its own application. You can actually still download it as a separate, completely separate application. Now, again, for this webinar, we're going to be doing all of our work inside the integrated version of Fusion inside of Resolve. And to be honest, that's probably how most people will be doing their work. That'll be watching this webinar. You might be doing a final online inside of Resolve. Maybe you need to get in there, do a couple little special effects. You can do that right from within your timeline. Now, the question is, where would you have seen work that has been done inside of Fusion? Well, if you've seen Avengers Age of Ultron or The Martian, Thor, or The Kingsman, or even if you're a big fan of American Horror Story, that is some of the most common places you may have seen Fusion in action. Okay? Now, like I said, I wanted to start out by getting in and just doing a little bit of a basic overview of how we've been doing effects up until this point inside of Resolve. And as you can see, I do have a shot in my timeline all set to go here. And let's grab my good friend the bear here. Now, I think I got too much of the bear, so let's just shorten this shot up quite a bit. Even that wasn't enough. Let's just bring this right back. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our bear shot and we're just going to shrink it down, move it from the left side of the screen over to the right side of the screen. Now, you might be thinking, Kev, that's something I would never, ever, ever, ever do inside of Fusion. And to be honest, you're probably right. But one thing that I like about this technique is that it's actually going to teach you a lot of things that you didn't know you need to know about Fusion that you definitely do need to know. Okay, now we're actually going to push that back just a little bit. I want to show you how we've been doing effects up until this point inside of Resolve. We're just going to switch over to the inspector here. We're just going to take this shot. I'm just going to zoom back on it just a little bit here. Perfect. I'm going to use my on-screen controls for transform. We'll just take that. We'll just shrink it right down like such to about there. I think we'll just position our bear off to the left-hand side of the screen. I'm positioned in a good place in my timeline. Let's just add a keyframe for position. Again, one thing I love about Resolve, the way that it's been developed, is it's been developed and created much like all of the nonlinear editing applications that we are accustomed to working with, whether it's Final Cut, whether it's Premiere, whether it's Media Composer. Okay, so let's now go down towards the end of our shot here. We're just going to take our bear. Mr. Bear, we're going to send you from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. We'll just fit that in here. I'll come right back to the beginning. We'll just hit the space bar. And there we go. Okay, so this is how we've been accustomed to doing effects work up until now. Now again, probably not something you will be doing inside of Fusion, but we're going to learn a lot about that. But before we do that, let's talk about the node-based compositing workflow. And we're just going to do the absolute most basic of composites so that you can see how this is going to work. Now for the technique that I'm going to show you, we actually don't even need this shot. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to move it over here to the right hand side of my timeline. I'm going to come back here and we're only going to be focusing on our shot right here. Okay. Now to get this footage from my Resolve timeline over into Fusion, it's actually quite a complicated process. Are you ready for it? Follow me here. I'm just simply going to click on the Fusion button down here at the bottom of the interface. And as soon as I do that, this shot has been immediately loaded up into Fusion and it will be all set to go. Now, keep in mind, you saw how long it took to switch from the Edit module to the Fusion module. It only does that once. Okay, normally then once you've done that for the first time, it's going to be a very quick process switching back and forth. Now, I'm just going to bring these nodes a little bit closer together. You can always zoom in and zoom out of the nodes by simply using the plus and minus keys, or that's also the dash and the equal key on the keyboard. You can actually, now let me tell you something, if you've got enough nodes that you got to shrink things down this much, that is a lot of compositing that you're doing. Okay. Now you'll notice that Fusion has named these two nodes two completely inappropriate things that don't tell us anything about anything. Media in 1, media out 1. Okay. Now that's all fine and good when we only have 2 nodes, but once we start getting into 10 or 15 nodes, we don't want to have media in 1 and media out 1 as the names for these nodes. So organization is exceptionally important, and naming things is the start of organization. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to take this node here. I'm going to use F2 on the keyboard on both Mac and Windows. I'm just going to call this city footage. Okay. And we're just going to call this node output. Okay. Now, inside of Fusion, the way that it works to apply effects is we're going to apply them as nodes. Now, we're going to start out with basic nodes, and as we get towards the end of this webinar, we're going to get into a little bit more of a complicated node. And you're going to see very quickly that how you attach nodes together is exceptionally important. Okay. Now again, not so much when we're starting out, but as we move along. Now you're going to notice that there's a lot of very common effects that you might use. They actually have shortcuts located right up here above the nodes window. Now I'm going to show you a different way to get access to them. And I'm actually going to deselect the city footage node just for 1 second. I'm going to press Shift and Space bar on the keyboard. This brings up the Select Tools window. I'm just going to type in blur. Okay, there's blur right there. Now to add it, fairly self-explanatory, I'm just going to hit add on the keyboard. Now why did I deselect city footage when I added the blur node? This is why. I'm going to do that again, Shift and Space bar. You'll see blur is remembered because it was the last tool that I added. I'm now going to add it, and you'll see that what Fusion will do is that it will automatically add the node after whatever the node selected is moving down the pipeline. Okay, so I had city footage selected coming down the pipeline. When I selected it, with it selected, and I added blur, it added it right afterwards. Okay, now blur is a fairly straightforward node to use. Okay, it has one input, it has one output. It does have an input for matte or mask. Now we'll get to that later on. Don't worry about that for right now. Okay. Now, to work with this node with it selected, you'll notice that I have, much like I did inside the Edit module, the inspector over here that I can now, with blur selected, come in and I can change that blur size to be whatever I want. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind, I'm just going to disconnect the blur node from the output node here for 1 second, is that at any point you can call up any clip on either display inside of Fusion by simply using these 2 buttons down here. The right circle representing the right monitor, the left circle representing the left monitor. So this is a very handy way to see before and after, to see something before it gets to another node, etc., etc. Now I disconnected the blur node from the output node for a very specific reason, because in a lot of cases this is one step that everybody forgets. They forget to add the whatever the node happens to be to the output node. Now you might be thinking, well, who cares? Well, this is why you need to care. Because if you come back to the Edit module, you'll notice that with those nodes disconnected, I now have nothing but black on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to head back to Fusion. You'll see it flips over right away. We're going to attach blur to output. I'm going to come back to the Edit module, and you'll now see that we have that effect looking the way that we want. Now I'm purposely going to park the time bar right there. And I'm just going to talk a little bit to kill time here for 1 second. There we go. Perfect. I wanted you to see those blue bars appearing. That is Resolve and Fusion rendering this effect. Okay. Now there is a command that you can use to turn that ability on and off. Now, unfortunately, the way that I have my screen set up, if I right click, it's actually located just outside of the view that you can see. It's actually called Render Cache Fusion Output. Now you'll see that I have 3 options. I'm actually going to call it up on the screen so that you can see it right here. You'll see that I have auto, on, and off. Now by default it's turned to auto. So to be honest, I'd say just leave it like that. The whole point is you want to have your Fusion nodes or your Fusion outputs rendered in your timeline. But the cool thing is that once you set things up in Fusion, you can go off and do other work, and Resolve and Fusion will render that stuff for you in the background so that when you're done doing whatever you're doing, hopefully, assuming it's not a huge, massive composite, your render will be done. Okay? So now what I can do is simply come back, hit the space bar, and there's our blurred footage, all set to go. All right, now what I want to do is I just want to reset this node back to the way it was originally, like I'd never gone into Fusion before. Now you might be thinking, okay, well maybe I'll come back to the Fusion module, I'll come in, I'll start deleting nodes. You don't need to do any of that. All you need to do is to simply right click and you can come down and reset Fusion composition. Of course, you'll be prompted saying, wait a second, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I'm sure. Let's reset that back the way it was. And now it's just like I had never stepped into Fusion to do any work with this footage. Okay, so let's come back here because what we want to now do is talk about this example. Okay, and it's a big one. And I say it's a big one only from a sense of what we're going to learn from this, not so much in the effect that it's going to create. Now, the first thing that's important to keep in mind with this effect, we're going to select that shot of the bear. See you later, it's gone. Okay. Because what's important to keep in mind when working with Fusion is that when you start out, we're choosing essentially the shot that we want to do compositing with. We're then going to bring in all the elements, nodes, effects, other shots, other elements. We're going to bring those in after the fact. Okay, so with this shot selected, I'm going to head back into Fusion. There's our media in 1 and media out 1 nodes. We're going to call this, of course, city footage. And we're going to call this output. Okay. And let's now bring in our bear shot. Now, our bear shot's right here. You'll remember that we had an in and out point marked when we took it and brought it into our Resolve Edit module. However, with that being said, when you bring a shot into Fusion, it's going to bring the entire shot in. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to get in and decide how much of this shot we want to use and where do we want it to appear. Okay, so let's right now just worry about how long we want this shot to be. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this shot 150 frames long. Okay, now first thing I need to do before I do that is call this shot bear footage. Okay. And with my now bear footage and city footage all set to go and the bear footage selected, I'm going to head on over to the inspector down here to the bottom of the window. Now you'll see that I have the ability to trim this shot. And what I'm going to do again is make it 150 frames long, meaning that I need to make it 149 as the out frame. Okay, now you'll notice that as soon as I do that and I make this 149, it immediately makes it 149 in the global in out. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, we'll get to that in just a second. You'll see how it works once I actually set the composite up. Okay, so let's do that. What we're going to do is we're going to take our bear footage and we're going to shrink it down. Now to do that, we need a node attached to it to do that. I'm going to leave this bear footage selected, and we can do it one of 2 ways. I'm going to grab it right from here just because it happens to be right above where I am, or I could use the Shift spacebar shortcut to call up the tools window and type in transform. But why would I do that when I'm already here? Okay, so I'm going to add transform. What I'm going to do is call it up on the right hand screen. Now you'll notice that where we are right now is we're at frame 206 and everything's turned gray. So what exactly is going on here? Because there's some weird stuff happening. Well, actually nothing weird is happening. Fusion's acting exactly like I'm telling it to. You'll remember I told Fusion I only wanted this shot to be 150 frames long. So if I come back to 150 frames, there you go. There's my footage right there, 149, and boom, then it will disappear. Okay, so Fusion's doing exactly what I want it to. Now, something else that's very important for me to point out to you, you'll notice that I have a yellow bar here and I have a yellow bar here. What's important to keep in mind is that we still live within that shot that we have in our Resolve timeline. This shot owns this composite. So what these two yellow bars represent is the in point and the out point of that specific shot. So these are the handles on either side. Now, this is going to come back to be important in just a second, but before it becomes super important, let's go back to that transform node. Let's shrink things down just a little bit here. We'll put this shot maybe right about there. I think that's pretty good. Okay. Now, to take this transform node and this bare footage and combine it with the city footage, I do need another node. And the node that we're going to use is the merge node. We're going to use that to merge these two shots together. Now, here's where things become important. Now, up until this point, I talked about how it didn't really matter, with the blur node, and even with the transform node, it has one input, one output. It does have a mask input, but we're not worrying about that too much right now. Okay. The merge node is a little bit different. You'll notice that if I hover over the input, this input here is the background. This input here is the foreground. These are very important that you assign these correctly, because if you don't, your footage will be going to the wrong place. Now, you don't want to be dragging the elements into the node. We want to take this node and assign the inputs where we want it to go. Now, I know that with the foreground input, I want that to be coming from the transform node. And the background city footage, I want to be coming in to the background. Now, you might be thinking, well, why didn't this update itself? Well, remember, we're still viewing the output of the transform node. If I switch over to the merge node, you'll now see that this footage appears exactly the way that I expected to. However, I did leave something out, and I started to talk about it, and I said I would come back to it, and now here's where I circle back to it. You'll remember that with our bare footage, when we got in and we set the trim to be 150 frames, that I said that the trim was set down here, but we also have this global in-out up here. Now, the global in-out represents where this shot is going to start in the grand scheme of our entire composite. So if I come all the way back here, technically this footage is started way back here. Maybe I don't want this footage to start until, let's say, frame 100. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this bar, drag it way down past frame 100. You'll notice that it immediately disappears. So now what I can do, I'm just going to be, ballparking it here. Frame 99 is perfectly fine for what we're doing. But this is how we can now get in and set up exactly where we want footage to start appearing, assuming we don't want it to start right from the beginning of the composite. Okay, so you'll notice now if I back things up, it's going to disappear. It's going to appear here. It'll sit on the screen for 150 frames, and then it's going to disappear. But that's more than enough time for us to do our composite. Okay, let's head back to the transform node, and what we're going to do here is I'm just going to zoom back just a little bit here. I think that's okay to 25. Okay, let's now take this, let's position it outside of the frame, right about there. Okay, and I'm just going to position this over a bit just so that I can see our composite. And we're going to, much like we had done before, we're going to add a keyframe for the center value. What we're now going to do is we're going to come down, and now was I even at the right frame? I don't even think I was. I actually need to come back here. Okay. And I believe I had that coming in somewhere around frame 99. Okay, let me actually just reposition this right in the middle of the frame here, just so we know for sure. Okay, perfect. There we go, right there. So at this point here, we're going to position this outside of the frame. Okay, we're going to add that keyframe for center. And somewhere down, I don't even remember where. Let's just take this. We're just going to position it over here just because, to be honest, I'm not going to do the math in my head. We'll get it pretty darn close, right to about there. Okay. And we'll position this now outside of the frame. Okay. Now you're going to notice that I actually added a keyframe in here that I don't necessarily want. Well, if you're an After Effects user, you'll know that you have the ability to jump from keyframe to keyframe by simply using the arrow keys located right up here to the left of that keyframe. I'm just going to remove that one. So what we now have, if we come back here and I deselect everything and just hit play, is we now have that shot moving from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, but more importantly, we've learned all of this new information that we didn't necessarily know we even needed to know, but you can see how important it was. Okay? So now again, remember, much like before, what we can now do is take that merge node, we're going to take it, we're going to drag it to the output node, we're going to switch back to the edit module. Here's our composite looking exactly the way that we had it before. And of course, if I leave Resolve, if I go off to do something else, Resolve is going to start rendering that for us automatically. Okay? So now what I want to do is I want to move on and I want to talk a little bit about creating another very common look. We'll create a vignette look. Okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to get in and I'm going to start creating something a little bit more complicated. Then what I want to do is talk a little bit about keyframing specifically, and then we'll wrap things up by talking about Fusion titling. Now you can see that render's done. We can come back. We can hit play. Once we get to frame 100, boom, there it is rocketing across the screen. All set to go. Now, one thing I keep trying to do each time I show you an example is double down by making things more complicated but showing you more things. Now, we're going to do that again right now. Now, you'll remember we talked about this before. We want to reset this back to be the way it was before. We're going to reset that Fusion composition. We're just going to say reset because we don't really care about what's going on. Let's pick a different shot here to work with, just because, to be honest, I'm getting sick of seeing that city shot here. Okay. And let's now take this shot, and what I want to do is a very common effect. I want to create a vignette effect. We're going to double up on the vignette. We're going to create a vignette effect with a little bit of a blur in there as well. Okay. Now again, you know, I'm going to select that. We're going to head on into Fusion. Okay. There's my two nodes again, as always. We're going to call this waterfalls. Okay. We're going to call this output. F2 is the keyboard shortcut we're using again. Okay. Now, here's how we're doubling down on this one, okay? We're going to create our vignette, but to do that, we actually need to use a different type of node. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me show you, okay? What we're going to do for this effect here specifically is I'm going to come up and I'm going to use a shape. Now, you'll see that I have a rectangle, I have an ellipse, and I can get in and create a polygon or a B-spline. What I'm going to do is with the waterfall selected, I'm going to come up and I'm going to use the circular ellipse tool. Now you'll notice that as soon as I do that, a new input has been created to this node that didn't appear to be there before. Okay. Now I can come up again and you'll notice that if I call up the ellipse on the right hand screen, it's just a circle. Nothing fancy, nothing crazy. Okay, but what we're going to do is we're going to take this waterfalls and we're going to attach it to the output. I'm just going to reposition things kind of like this here. Okay, and with our output, I'm going to call that up on the right hand side of the display here. There we go. Okay, and let me just close up our media pool. There we go. Even easier to see things now. We'll just sort of give ourselves a little bit more screen real estate here. Can I do that here? Perfect. Okay. So what we've done with this ellipse is we've now essentially cut this out. And what we have the ability to do with this ellipse is to basically just grab it and more or less make it look however we want. Okay, I'm going to do that. And with the ellipse selected, I'm going to grab the soft edge. We're going to soft edge that right out like that. Now, I could leave this the way that it is. However, if I was to put any footage underneath it, this is, of course, completely transparent. So I want to take some more information that we've learned up until this point to combine this to create a proper composite. Okay, so I'm going to deselect, or I'm going to unattach my waterfalls from my output node. Okay, now, essentially what I've done here is the same as taking this and adding it to a mask input on an effect, and you'll see how that's going to come into play in just a second. Okay, I'm going to put these two relatively close together just so I can move them up a little bit here. What I should do is let's do that again here. I'm just going to undo that, select, move them up, perfect. Okay, now I'm going to add a new node, and we're going to add a background node. Okay, now a background is just that. It's just a color solid. If I call this up on the left hand side of the screen, we can make this whatever color we want. I have it as set as black right now. Let's just bring my color wheel right up here. We could make this blue, green, whatever. There we go. Perfect. But again, for us, black is the color we want to go with. Now you'll remember, much like before, what we want to do is use a merged node to combine these two together. The background is going to be, appropriately enough, the background. Okay. The waterfalls is going to be the foreground. Now what I should do, remember, is we should be taking the foreground and attaching it to that waterfalls, call that up on the right hand side of the screen, and there we go. But I want to double down on this, okay? Because what I want to do is I want to blur out here. Now, to be honest, that's actually not as much of a soft edge as I would like. I'd actually like to be a little bit more soft edge. Let me actually just move this in just a little bit. Okay, good. So let's now get that blur node. I'm going to select the waterfalls. Now we can actually grab the blur node from right here if we wanted to. Let's add blur. And what we're going to do to make this kind of a little bit interesting is I'm going to make this blurred. Okay. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach another ellipse node right here to the mask input of this effect. But I'm not going to go back and I'm not going to select the one that I had just done, which was right here. I'm actually just going to take this ellipse tool and I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it. What I'm now going to do is I'm actually just going to take that and I'm going to add it to the blur node like such. Now you'll notice that what it did was it immediately blurred the screen. And it's actually going out here off into not being blurred. I actually want that in reverse. So I'm just going to invert this node like that. And then what I can do is just adjust the node ever so slightly to make it blur just a little bit more before it gets to the edge of the vignette to create a composite that looks a little something like that. Let's get that out of the way here. Let's give ourselves a little bit more screen real estate. You'll see now what we have is the vignette with the blur with our footage. So now you're starting to see how these elements are all starting to come together to create these, to be honest, this could be quite a complex composite. But in a lot of cases, what I'm doing is just, shift space, adding the nodes that I know. I'm copying and pasting nodes and adding them to inputs of other effects to create very cool looks very quickly and very easily. Okay, and you'll see these effects render pretty darn fast. I can now hit the space bar. Here we go. It's the vignette effect looking exactly the way that I want. All set to go. Okay. So let's now take this and let's push this even farther. This is a great technique I did for a company called Rampant Design Tools. I want to show it to you here because their elements are so fantastic and they're perfect to work with inside of Fusion. Okay. So again, much like we had done before, we're going to right click and we're going to reset this composition. That's fine. I'm going to come back to the media pool, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a little bit of a juxtaposition here. So let's take one of our city shots here. Let's take this one, and what we want to be doing is talking about the city in contrast to the, now that's actually a Fusion clip that I don't want to use. I'm just going to remove that here. And let's take, we'll go with this shot again here. And what we're going to do is we're going to utilize this. Let's utilize it with the waterfall. Okay, now again, keep in mind that we're not going to be adding the waterfall until we get into Fusion. So let's come into Fusion right here. And we're also not going to concern ourselves either with where these shots are going to start and end, because to be honest, I'm just going to let it just run as long as the shot needs to run for. So again, we're going to take this, we're going to call this city footage. Okay, we'll call this output, again, F2. We're going to head on back to the media pool. We're going to grab our, let's grab our serene forest shot here. We'll just call this forest shot. Actually, we'll just call it forest. We don't even need to call it. We'll call it forest footage just to match the other one here. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Now here's where things get kind of interesting. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these rampant style mats here. Okay, let's just I'll grab this one. Okay. Now what I'm going to do with this element is I'm actually just going to delay it so that it starts a little bit later, because remember, our footage doesn't start down here until frame 63. So what I'm going to do with this Rampant Design Tools element is I'm actually going to hold its first frame. Let's just hold it like 80 frames. I think that's pretty good. Okay. Let me just remove the media pool here. I'll just drag this window over a little bit here. Perfect. Give ourselves a little bit more screen real estate because we're going to need it once we start getting in and compositing with these elements. All right. So let's do this first of all, just to show you how this is going to work. I'm going to take my city footage. I'm going to add that blur node back in here because you'll remember that I did talk about, and I did just show the mask input. Okay, right here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize this Rampant Design Tools element. And what I should actually have done is not necessarily pulled that all the way over, because I do want to see the left side of the screen here, is that this Rampant Design Tools element is actually kind of a cool element. Okay. And what it does give me the ability to do once I turn this blur node on, we blur things out, is I can take the mask channel, assign it to the Rampant Design Tools element, and you can take a look at what it's actually doing. It's actually coming in and it's cutting things out like such. Okay, it's cutting out that blur effect. Okay, so much like we had taken that built-in element, in this case the rectangular or the ellipse tool, and taken that and used that as the channel assignment, you could take any element that you want and use that as a mask inside of your Fusion composites. Okay, now for us, that's not quite what we want to do here. I just wanted to throw that out there just as sort of a little primer for you. I'm just going to delete the blur node. I'm going to disconnect the city footage from the background. Now what I would like to do is I'd like to utilize this Rampant Design Tools element to cut out this forest shot. Okay, the forest shot's going to be happening right over top of the city footage, and I want to utilize the Rampant Design Tools element to do just that. So how do we go about doing this? Okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to call up another node that we haven't used yet. That's the channel Booleans node. That's channel Booleans plural. Now, you'll notice again, like I said, we're stepping things up a little bit. This node actually has quite a few inputs going on here. Okay, now you'll notice that we have one which is a foreground, we have one that is a background, we have one that is a effect mask, we have one that's a matte, and then we have our output. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign the Rampant Design Tools element as the foreground. We're going to assign the forest footage as the... Now actually, before I do that, this is actually a good one for me to show you. Okay, let me actually just disconnect that just for 1 second. This is why it's important to attach the inputs to the footage as opposed to the other way around. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this forest footage and I'm going to drag it and I'm going to attach it to the, let's attach it, I believe that, what is that, the mask channel at the bottom? I believe that's the mask channel. Yes, it is. Perfect. I'm going to assign this forest footage to the mask channel. Okay, we'll just assign it, drag it right there. Perfect. Okay. Now you'll see that if I come here, it's actually assigned to the mask channel. But what if I was to take this and just drag it and just, right into the middle here? Boom. Oh, well, what's that going to? Oh, okay, well, it's going to the background. Okay, perfect. Oh, you know what? Now it's actually going to the mask channel. Oh, well, now it's going to the output channel. Oh, well, now it's going to... What is going on here? What is this thing doing? Well, what's important to keep in mind, and I'm just going to hover over this for 1 second, you'll see that this is going to the background. You'll also notice that depending on which input I drag to the footage will determine what color that connection is. So if you remember that the green connection is the input or the foreground connection, you'll always know that no matter where you drag this, this will always be going to the foreground input of that node. Okay, this is why I like to take my nodes right from whatever the node that, or take my my inputs from whatever the node that I'm working with, and I like to assign them directly. Boom, you're going to be the foreground. Boom, you're going to be the foreground. You're going to be the foreground. You're going to be the background, etc., etc. Okay. Now in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to take the foreground and we're going to assign it to the Rampant Design Tools element. We're going to take the background element. We're going to assign it to our forest footage. Okay, let's call up our channel Booleans node to see exactly what is going on here. Okay, I'm just going to come back a little bit to about here. I think is pretty good. And what we're going to do is we're going to head on up to the channel Booleans in the inspector. We're going to take that operation and we're going to change it to multiply. Now, as soon as I do that, you'll now see that we have our forest footage being cut out exactly the way that we would expect it to be cut out. Okay. Now there's something that's important to keep in mind about this Rampant Design Tools element. It's 4K. I'm only working in an HD project. So what does that mean for me? It means that I can actually get in and shrink this element down or take it and manipulate it in the frame to utilize that 4K information. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to head back to our we can use the resize or the transform node. I'm going to use the transform node. Let's make sure we have Rampant Design Tools selected. I'm going to drop it in here, and what we're now going to do with this transform node is we're going to shrink things down. Let's take the size, let's shrink it right down. Okay. Now it might look like it's not doing what we think it is, but I just want to take it and shrink it way down for now and then reposition it here. Okay. Let's bring it south just so that you can see. There we go. Perfect. Okay. This is now representing the edge of the frame. You'll see that if I drag through, we can see exactly what this element is going to do right there. And what I actually want to see is the edge of the frame. Perfect. Okay, so what this now lets me do is it lets me center things up, resize it a little bit, so that we're now utilizing the full frame version of this element because we've shrunk it down with the transform node before it hits channel Booleans. Okay, the reason I want to show you this is one of the most common effects that you probably will want to know how to do inside of Fusion, how to take a matte element and have it cut a layer out, especially in an example of what we're going to do right now. Okay, now if we wanted to take this and combine it with the city footage node, you know what we're going to do. I don't need to tell you. I can select channel Booleans, shift space bar. I'm going to simply type in, merge. There we go. We're going to add it to channel Booleans. Now keep in mind that node or that attachment input is yellow. That's for the background, which we don't want. We want this element to be the foreground. There's our foreground. Let's attach that to channel Booleans. Let's take the background. Let's attach that to the city footage. And now what we have, if we check out our merge node, is we have these two elements merged together exactly the way that we want them to. Now with that being said, what happens with this Rampant Design Tools element is it comes to an end. As much as many good things do, it comes to an end. Okay. Now you're also going to notice, if you look very carefully, Kev made a bit of a mistake at the top of the frame, right up there. Okay. Don't worry. Simply come back to the transform node. We can probably just reposition this like such, maybe give it a little bit of a size adjustment. There we go. And we're now back to being all set to go. Now what I was getting at there was that this element comes to an end, and watch what happens when it does. When it does, everything just sort of jumps back to the other footage, which is not what we want. We don't want that forest footage, we want the city footage. So what we want to do is take that Rampant Design Tools element, just extend it forever. Well, the beauty thing is, you'll remember that when we were holding that first frame, we can also hold that last frame. I'm just going to hold it for like 600 frames. So this way now, no matter what happens when we get to the end, that city footage will always be there. Okay? There we go. Okay? Now, the reason that we can do this with this element is because the element has a transparency and it starts on nothing. That's why we could utilize the hold first frame and not have to worry about the global in-out, because it's sitting there completely transparent, not actually doing anything. So that's why we only have to worry about the holding of the frames as opposed to the global in and out. Now remember, before we get this all wrapped up, let's just move our city footage here. Let's grab that merge node. We're going to take it, we're going to drag it right over there to the output node, and then we will be all set to go. So you can see this is a fairly complex composite that we've created here, and really we've only used, these are footage nodes here. Footage node, footage node, footage node, and basically 3 effects nodes to create this complex composite. And keep in mind, at any time if you wanted to get in and let's say you wanted to add a brightness and contrast effect to the forest footage, no problem. With it selected, you can simply add that node, get in, maybe you want to make some lift changes, get in and adjust the gamma a little bit. You can do all that by simply adding nodes in between other nodes to create the look that you want to create. Okay, couple things I want to show you before we wrap things up. Now, believe it or not, we're going to go back to basics here. I'm just going to switch back to the edit module for 1 second. I'm going to right click. We're going to reset that composition. We'll just say reset there. Very nice. Okay, perfect. And we're going to head back into Fusion. And what we're going to do is we're going to, again, as always, F2, city footage. Okay. Again, F2, output. Okay. With our city footage selected, we're going to come up to that blur node. I'm going to take blur, we're going to add it in here. I want to add a few keyframes to what this transition or this effect is going to look like. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this value at 0 to about here. Now I'm just going to start picking arbitrary positions to start adding keyframes. Okay, so I'm going to add a keyframe there, and we're going to come to here, and let's just add another keyframe by adjusting this value to be, I don't know, somewhere around 10. Okay. Now that's all fine and good, being able to jump back and forth between keyframes like this, but what I really need to see is exactly what is going on with the keyframes that I currently have inside of my Fusion project. Well, much like the inspector and much like the nodes and the media pool and the effects library that we have access to inside of Fusion, we also have access to our keyframes, just like such. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the middle mouse button to pull our nodes over just a little bit, because I want you to see that we do have our blur effect right here, and there is our effect. It's a little bit on the small side, so let me just drag this over just a little bit. We'll just zoom this back a little bit. Perfect, because I don't really care about my nodes right now. I do so care about my animation. Okay, so I want to zoom in on that just a little bit so that you can see exactly what is going on right here. So we don't need to necessarily jump back by using our keyframe locators. We could if we wanted to, but we also have the ability to get in and see them visually right here. What this also gives us the ability to do as well that's very handy. You'll notice that I can come down and I can select that keyframe and just start dragging it down like that to stretch things out. Okay. One thing that I also love is the ability to, if I want to, I can actually hold Command or Control down to create a hold keyframe. So what's going to happen is, once that keyframe gets to here, it's actually going to add a duplicate keyframe in. So if I jump down, you'll see that's just another keyframe. So what we can do is very quickly create animation by then just adding more keyframes and then coming down and increasing this animation as we go. So you'll see that what we've created, move into the blur, then hold it, move into the next stage of the blur, then hold it, move into the final stage of the blur, and then hold it. So you can see that with the keyframe window, we actually have a lot more flexibility to get in and manipulate keyframes than just working in the inspector. Now, you'll notice that I don't have a ton of screen real estate the way that I'm working now. Obviously, I work on a larger screen, but I'm recording this in a very specific way, so it's a lot easier for you to see. If you're working with a larger display, you're going to have a lot of screen real estate to get in and to put these windows exactly where you need them to be to see exactly what you need to see. Okay, last thing that I want to show you before we wrap things up and I throw it back to Michael. I think we're still sort of coming in around the 45-minute mark, which I'm happy with. Again, we're going to head back to that edit module. I'm going to come back, right click, let's reset that composition back to the way it was before. Very nice. You know what? Let's change it up. Let's go with this night shot for the very last example here that I want to throw out there. And I want to talk a little bit about titling. All right, and to talk about this, what I want to do is I want to close the media pool and open the effects library. Now you'll see that by default I am on the toolbox, and what I'd like to do is head on down to the titles section. Now it kind of spoils it a bit as soon as I go into titles, and you can see that I have these standard titles, but more specifically for what we're talking about, I want to talk about the Fusion titles. Now Fusion titles are great not only because they look fantastic, but because they are, again, another great learning tool for us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the 3D title in a box. I really like this text look, and I'm just going to click down here. There's my long title in a box. It certainly is. Okay, and what we're going to do is with this selected, I'm going to come in and I'm going to open Fusion. Now, to be honest, I really don't care what's going on in the background, so it doesn't really matter that it comes through as transparent. What I'm also going to do is just close up those keyframes there. There we go. Very nice. We'll just bring this over to be a little bit more centered, and you'll notice that we actually have sort of 3 nodes stacked up on top of each other. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click on those nodes. Let's see if I can actually just expand this window out just a little bit so you get a better idea of exactly what went into creating that long title in a box. You'll see, again, a great learning tool for you to get in and to figure out exactly what is going on inside this composite. Okay, this is what I love about it. It's a very easy way to see how something was created. Now, I say a very easy way to see it, maybe not necessarily to create it right off the bat, but it's definitely going to give you some ideas. Now, to close this back up, what we're going to do is just right click, and I'm going to come down to collapse group. So there you go. You'll see that we can collapse that group down into a much easier to navigate. Well, I guess in this case, it's basically 2 nodes for us to work with, but just a more easier way to figure out exactly what's going on. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call up the inspector. Now, you'll see that we have the tools and we have the modifiers, but what we want to do is we actually want to get in and to adjust the text. There we go. Perfect. I had to deselect it and come back to it for some reason. It didn't seem to like it when I first selected it. So what we're going to do now is just give ourselves a little bit of screen real estate back here. There we go. Perfect. And what we're going to do is inside that long title in a box, we're just going to type in Pro Video Coalition. Okay. And for the purposes of what we're doing, I'm just going to make the text just a little bit bigger, just so that it fits a little bit better inside of that box. And believe it or not, I'm done. I could get in adjust the text color, all that type of stuff. What I also have the ability to do is we twirl that down, you'll see I can get in and adjust the box material. So let's say, PVC's colors weren't, blue. Maybe they were red. We could come in and make that adjustment very quickly and very easily. You can even get in, adjust, the specular color. You can get in and adjust the lights, the backlights, and even the motion blur controls. I'm happy with the way that this looks. So all I, of course, have to do is simply come back to the edit module, and this is now all set to go. Now you'll notice that the effect just sort of starts out on screen, sort of giving us at a 90-degree angle. So what I like to do sometimes is just get in and add a quick dissolve. Now to add that quick dissolve, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in and I can actually just grab it right from the top here. Let's see if I can actually be specific enough. There we go, perfect. And just add that dissolve just like that, perfect. There's that quick fade in. And we could do the same thing at the end. You just have to be very specific with where you put your mouse. You'll notice there you go right there. I could grab that dissolve, that handle right there. So at the end it will start to do its spin and then just fade out. Okay, we've covered a lot of stuff, and I hope this has given you just a very little bit of a primer of the type of things that you can do when working inside of Fusion, inside of Resolve. And if you are a Resolve user, I highly recommend you get in, start playing around with Fusion. It's a fantastic tool that I guarantee will take your work to the next level. And with that, I want to throw it back to Michael Horton.